October 21st, 1944, Aachen, Germany. The ancient fortress city. Germans were terrified when U.S. 240mm Howitzers completely crushed their heavily built fortresses. For centuries, these massive concrete walls had stood as symbols of German strength, designed to withstand anything the enemy could throw at them. The Nazi commanders were absolutely confident. Their bunkers were built to resist the heaviest guns in existence. But then came a sound unlike anything they had ever heard. The thunder of American 240mm Howitzers shook the earth itself. Each shell weighed 360 pounds and carried enough explosive power to shatter walls that had protected Germany for generations. In minutes, fortresses that were supposed to be impregnable were reduced to rubble and dust. German soldiers who had never shown fear began abandoning their positions at the first sound of these monster guns. But how did America build weapons so powerful that they could break the unbreakable? What made these guns so terrifying that an entire army lost faith in their strongest defenses? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The acrid smell of cordite hung heavy in the morning air as Oberst Heinrich Weber adjusted his field glasses. From his command post deep within the west wall fortifications surrounding Aachen, he watched American troops massing in the distance. The concrete walls around him were 4 feet thick, reinforced with steel and designed by Germany's finest military engineers. Every calculation had been precise. These bunkers could withstand direct hits from 2 to 10mm guns, the largest artillery pieces the Wehrmacht intelligence had ever recorded in American almost service. Weber lit his pipe and exhaled slowly. His garrison had held this position for 3 years. Behind him, radioman Klaus Richter monitored communication frequencies, while Hauptmann Franz Müller studied defensive firing positions through his periscope. The autumn morning felt almost peaceful despite the distant rumble of engines and the occasional crack of sniper fire. "Herr Oberst," Richter called softly, "American artillery spotters are moving into position approximately 2 kilometers northeast." Weber nodded. "Standard procedure. The Americans would soften their positions with conventional artillery before attempting an assault. His men had weathered such bombardments before. The reinforced concrete would hold, just as it always had. German engineering was superior to anything the Americans could produce. In the civilian shelters beneath Aachen's medieval streets, Anna Müller pulled her woolen coat tighter around her shoulders. The 42-year-old schoolteacher had lived through the British bombing raids of 1943, had seen her classroom windows shatter from distant artillery fire, but somehow the city's ancient walls had always protected its people. Her husband had died at Stalingrad 2 years earlier, leaving her alone with their 10-year-old son Heinrich. The boy slept fitfully on a makeshift cot beside her, exhausted from another night of air raid sirens. Anna pressed her ear against the stone wall of the shelter. The rumbling seemed different today, deeper, more ominous. Through the small ventilation grate, she could hear German soldiers calling to each other in voices that carried an edge of tension she had never detected before. Something was different about this morning. Above ground, Weber checked his watch. 8:47 hours. American artillery would begin soon. He had experienced their conventional bombardments many times. The 155mm guns created impressive noise and fury, but the concrete held. Always the concrete held. The first shell arrived at 8:51 hours. Weber felt the impact through the soles of his boots before he heard the detonation. The concrete floor beneath him shuddered, not the brief tremor of conventional artillery, but a sustained shaking that seemed to come from the earth itself. Dust cascaded from the ceiling joints. His coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "Mein Gott," Müller whispered, dropping his periscope. "What was that?" The second shell struck 15 seconds later. This time the electric lights flickered. A fine crack appeared in the wall beside the radio equipment. Richter looked up from his headset, eyes wide with confusion. "Herr Oberst, that was not 155mm. Weber grabbed his field glasses and peered through the observation slit. In the distance he could see the massive muzzle flash of an American gun unlike anything in his intelligence files. The barrel appeared enormous, longer than any field piece he had ever encountered. Even at 2 kilometers distance, the concussion wave from its firing was visible as a shimmering distortion in the morning air. The third shell landed directly on the bunker complex 200 meters to their left. Weber watched in disbelief as 3 feet of reinforced concrete simply vanished in a fountain of dust and debris. Steel reinforcement bars, twisted like wire, protruded from the smoking crater where an entire defensive position had stood moments before. "Das ist unmöglich," Miller stammered. "Impossible. Our fortifications are designed to withstand." The fourth shell cut off his words. This one struck their own bunker. The explosion was beyond anything Weber had experienced in 4 years of warfare. The sound was not merely heard, but felt, a physical force that seemed to compress his entire body. The concrete walls around him flexed visibly, bowing inward under the tremendous pressure. Chunks of ceiling crashed down onto the radio equipment. The lights went out completely in the darkness. Weber heard something that chilled him more than the detonation itself. The sound of his own men screaming. Emergency lighting flickered on, revealing a scene of devastation. The north wall of the bunker had cracked from floor to ceiling. Water pipes had burst, flooding the floor. Most disturbing of all, the steel door that sealed their position, 3 inches of armor plate designed to stop rifle fire, had been bent inward by the concussion. "Richter, get Berlin on the radio," Weber ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Tell them the Americans have deployed a new artillery system. Tell them our fortifications are not sufficient." But Richter's radio lay in pieces, destroyed by falling concrete. They were cut off, isolated in a bunker that had just proven vulnerable to weapons they had never imagined could exist. 4,000 miles away, in the industrial heart of New York State, the weapon that had just shattered Weber's confidence was being manufactured with the precision and power of American industry at full wartime production. The Watervliet arsenal had been forging cannons since 1813, but nothing in its long history compared to the massive 240mm howitzer now rolling off its production lines. Master machinist Robert Sullivan wiped sweat from his forehead as he guided the boring machine through another section of gun barrel. The steel was harder than anything he had worked with before, requiring diamond-tipped cutting tools and constant cooling. Each barrel stretched over 30 feet in length and weighed more than 10 tons when completed. The precision required was extraordinary. Tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch bore dimensions that had to remain perfectly uniform across the entire length. "Sullivan, how many more hours on that barrel?" called shift supervisor Thomas Bradley, checking his clipboard against the massive production schedule posted on the factory wall. "Another 6 hours minimum, Mr. Bradley. This steel fights back harder than anything we've ever cut." Around them, the arsenal hummed with 24-hour production. 3 shifts of workers, including hundreds of women who had taken over traditional metalworking roles, operated the massive lathes and boring machines. The sound was constant, the screech of cutting tools, the hiss of cooling systems, the rhythmic hammering of steam forges. Sparks showered from grinding wheels as barrels were finished to exact specifications. Sullivan had been machining artillery pieces for 3 years, but the 240mm project impressed him with its sheer scale. Each gun required more steel than 5 conventional howitzers. The ammunition alone was staggering, shells that weighed 360 pounds requiring special hoists and loading equipment. The United States was building these weapons faster than any nation had ever produced heavy artillery in the history of warfare. "You know what I heard from the shipping department?" Bradley said, leaning closer to Sullivan's machine. "We're turning out more heavy guns in 1 month than the Germans produced in all of 1943. Sullivan nodded, guiding his cutting tool through another pass. He had seen the classified production figures. American steel mills were producing more high-grade artillery steel in a single week than German factories could manage in 6 months. The difference was not just in quantity, but in quality. American metallurgy had advanced beyond anything available to the enemy. In the distance, another barrel was being lifted by overhead cranes toward the proof testing facility. Each gun would be fired dozens of times with full charges before being approved for shipment overseas. Quality control was absolute. No weapon left Watervliet unless it met specifications that exceeded anything in the world. "That barrel you're working on," Bradley continued, "it'll be firing on German positions within 8 weeks." Sullivan smiled grimly and continued his work. Every cut of his machine, every precise measurement, every hour of labor was bringing the war closer to its end. The Germans had built their fortresses to resist the weapons they knew. They had no defense against the industrial might of a free nation at full production. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Sergeant First Class John Arthod studied the massive artillery piece that would soon be his responsibility. The 240mm Howitzer dominated the training field like a steel dinosaur, its barrel elevated toward the autumn sky. 25 men were required to operate the weapon effectively, from the gun crew who loaded and fired to the specialists who maintained the complex hydraulic systems. "Listen up. Men," Arthod called to his assembled crew. "This weapon weighs 64,700 pounds in firing position. It takes 12 hours to set up properly, 4 hours to disassemble for movement. The shells weigh 360 pounds each and were expected to maintain a firing rate of 40 rounds per day." Private First Class Mike O'Connor raised his hand. "Sergeant, how do we move something that heavy?" "M33 prime mover," Arthod replied, pointing to the massive truck parked nearby, "plus a separate trailer for the ammunition. This isn't like the 105s you trained on back home. Everything about this weapon requires more men, more equipment, more precision." The crew gathered around as Arthod demonstrated the loading procedure. Each shell required a special hoist to lift it from the ground to the breech. The powder charges came in separate containers, each one handled with extreme care. The elevation and traverse mechanisms were powered by hydraulic systems that had to be maintained constantly. "The effective range is 23,000 yards, Arthod continued. That's almost 13 miles. "When you fire this gun, you're reaching out farther than most artillery pieces can even dream of. And what you hit stays hit." Training with the 240mm was unlike anything the men had experienced. The recoil was so powerful that the weapon had to be anchored with special spades driven deep into the earth. Even then, each shot drove the gun backward several inches, requiring constant adjustment of position. The sound of firing was deafening despite heavy ear protection, but what impressed Arthod most was the weapon's accuracy. During test firing, they had consistently placed shells within 50 yards of targets at maximum range. German fortifications, built to withstand smaller guns, would have no defense against this level of precision and power. "Sergeant," asked Private First Class Tony Kowalski, "what happens when we get to Europe?" Arthod looked across the training field towards the distant targets, already shattered by weeks of practice firing. "When we get to Europe, son, we're going to knock down every wall the Germans ever built." The training was intensive and demanding. Each crew member had to master multiple positions: loader, rammer, elevation operator, traverse operator, ammunition handler. The physical demands were enormous. Loading a 360-pound shell required perfect coordination and timing. A mistake could injure or kill crew members instantly. Night training was particularly challenging. Working by flashlight and moonlight, the crews had to maintain the same level of precision and safety. German defensive positions would not wait for daylight, and American artillery had to be ready to fire around the clock. "Remember," Arthod told his men during one evening session, "every shell we fire over there saves American lives. The Germans have been building bunkers and fortresses for years, thinking they're safe behind concrete walls. We're going to show them what American engineering can do when it sets its mind to breaking things." As autumn turned to winter, the 697th Field Artillery Battalion completed its training and prepared for deployment to Europe. Their destination was classified, but rumors suggested they would be supporting the push toward Germany itself. The 240mm Howitzers were being shipped ahead, carefully crated and loaded aboard transport ships that would carry them across the Atlantic. For Arthod and his men, the training period had transformed them from conventional artillery crews into specialists in heavy bombardment. They had learned to operate the most powerful mobile artillery piece in the American arsenal. Soon, they would have the opportunity to prove that training against the strongest fortifications the enemy could build. The thunderclap that rolled across the valley on October 21, 1944, announced the arrival of a new era in warfare. Sergeant First Class John Arthod crouched beside his 240mm howitzer, watching through field glasses as the first shell struck German positions around Aachen. Even at firing distance, the explosion was visible as a towering column of dust and debris that rose hundreds of feet into the air. "Target hit," called forward observer Lieutenant William Hayes through the radio headset. "Grid 347258, direct hit on bunker complex. Estimate complete destruction of position." Arthod had been firing artillery for 2 years, but nothing had prepared him for the devastating effect of these massive shells. The German bunkers, built to withstand conventional bombardment, simply ceased to exist when struck by 360 pounds of high explosive. Where moments before there had been concrete observation posts and machine gun nests, now there were only smoking craters in the earth. "Load high explosive," Arthod ordered his crew. Private First Class Mike O'Connor and Tony Kowalski wrestled the massive shell from its transport cradle to the loading hoist. The hydraulic system lifted the projectile smoothly to the breech, where it was rammed home with mechanical precision. The powder charge followed, 6 separate bags of propellant that would drive the shell more than 12 miles to its target. "Ready to fire," called Gunner Corporal James Mitchell from his position at the elevation controls. "Fire when ready," Arthod replied. The detonation was a physical blow to everyone within 100 yards of the gun. The muzzle blast created a pressure wave that could be felt in the chest and stomach. A fountain of flame erupted from the barrel, followed by a cloud of smoke that temporarily obscured the entire battery position. The gun itself recoiled violently despite the massive spades anchoring it to the earth, sliding backward several inches before the hydraulic recuperator brought it back into battery. Through his field glasses, Arthod watched the shell's impact 23 seconds later. Another German strongpoint vanished in a burst of smoke and flying concrete. The psychological effect on enemy forces was immediate and devastating. German soldiers who had never retreated from their positions began abandoning bunkers that remained intact, unwilling to risk facing the next salvo. Across the battlefield, in the shattered remains of his command bunker, Oberst Heinrich Weber struggled to maintain communication with his scattered units. The American bombardment had destroyed most of his hardline telephone connections. Radio contact was sporadic at best. What reports he did receive painted a picture of complete defensive collapse. Herr Oberst, called Hauptmann Franz Müller, emergency lighting casting harsh shadows across his face. Bunker 7 reports direct hit by unknown artillery. Bunker 12 is abandoned. The crew fled after the first impact nearby. Weber stared at his tactical map, trying to comprehend what was happening to his carefully planned defense. For 3 years, these positions had been considered impregnable. German military engineers had calculated the exact thickness of concrete required to resist the heaviest American artillery. Those calculations had proven utterly inadequate. Through his damaged periscope, Weber could see American infantry advancing across ground that should have been swept by defensive fire from intact bunkers. But his bunkers were no longer intact. The unknown American weapon was systematically destroying every fortified position along his line. "Sir," Muller continued, his voice tight with strain, "we're receiving reports of mass desertion from sectors 4 and 5. The men are saying the Americans have brought up siege guns from the Great War." Weber knew better. He had studied the massive German and Austrian siege guns of 1914-1918. Those weapons had been railroad-mounted monsters, incapable of tactical mobility. What the Americans were using was something entirely different, a mobile weapon system that could be positioned and fired with devastating effect wherever needed. The next American shell landed close enough to their bunker that the remaining lights failed completely. In the darkness, Weber made the most difficult decision of his military career. Müller prepared to withdraw to the secondary positions. Pass the word to all remaining units, execute delaying action, and fall back. We cannot hold against these weapons. It was the first time in the war that Weber had ordered a retreat from prepared defensive positions. But continuing to hold static fortifications against American 240mm howitzers was not tactical stubbornness, it was suicide. 6 miles behind the German lines, Anna Müller felt each impact through the stone walls of her shelter. The explosions seemed to come from all directions now, no longer the distant rumble of conventional artillery, but the earth-shaking detonations of weapons beyond her comprehension. Her son Heinrich pressed against her side, wide-eyed with terror at sounds that seemed to come from the end of the world. "Mama, what are those sounds?" Heinrich whispered. Anna had no answer. She had lived through the bombing of Aachen, had endured months of conventional artillery fire. But this was different. Each explosion felt powerful enough to bring down the cathedral itself. Through the ventilation grate of their shelter, she could hear German soldiers running past in apparent panic, something she had never witnessed before. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Other civilians huddled in the shelter shared her confusion and fear. Old Herr Schmidt, who had fought at Verdun in the previous war, shook his head in disbelief. "In 1916 we had the Big Bertha and the Paris gun," he muttered. But even those monsters did not sound like this. Frau Weber, whose husband commanded one of the fortress sectors, sobbed quietly in the corner. She had received no word from Heinrich since the bombardment began. The telephone lines were cut, the radio station silent. For the first time since the war began, the German defensive system around Aachen had been completely disrupted. Above ground, the systematic destruction continued. American forward observers, working with unprecedented accuracy, directed shell after shell onto targets that had been considered invulnerable. Concrete bunkers that had taken months to build were eliminated in minutes. Machine gun nests vanished in single explosions. Command posts became smoking ruins. The psychological effect extended beyond the immediate target area. German units positioned miles away could hear the tremendous explosions and see the columns of smoke rising from what had been their strongest defensive positions. Word spread rapidly through the Wehrmacht that the Americans had deployed a new weapon of extraordinary power. Morale, already strained by months of retreat, plummeted further. 2 days later, at his headquarters behind American lines, General Omar Bradley studied intelligence reports that confirmed what his artillery observers had already reported. The 240mm howitzers were proving devastatingly effective against German fortifications. Enemy resistance around Aachen was collapsing faster than anyone had dared hope. "General," said Colonel James Patterson, his artillery advisor, "the preliminary results exceed all expectations. We're seeing defensive positions abandoned after just 1 or 2 rounds land nearby. The Germans appear to have no answer for this level of firepower." Bradley nodded slowly, smoking his pipe as he considered the implications. For months, American infantry had paid a heavy price assaulting prepared German positions. Every bunker, every fortified house, every defensive line had cost lives. The 240mm offered a different approach, used superior firepower to save American blood. "How many of these guns do we have available?" Bradley asked. "Currently 16 in the European theater, with more arriving monthly. Production at Watervliet Arsenal has exceeded all projections." Bradley studied the tactical maps spread across his table. If the 240mm could break fortified positions this effectively, it would change his entire approach to breaching the West Wall. Instead of costly infantry assaults, he could rely on methodical artillery preparation to eliminate German strongpoints before his troops advanced. "I want these guns deployed at every major fortress complex we're facing," Bradley decided. "Metz, the Siegfried Line positions, anywhere the Germans think they're safe behind concrete. We're going to demonstrate that American industrial capacity has made their defensive strategy obsolete." Patterson made notes on his clipboard. "Sir, there's another factor to consider. Intelligence reports suggest that word of our new artillery is spreading throughout the German army. Unit morale appears to be declining significantly in sectors where the 240mm has been employed. this was perhaps the most important effect of all. The German army had built its defensive doctrine around the belief that properly constructed fortifications could withstand any attack. For 3 years, that belief had proven largely accurate. American infantry had been forced to assault bunkers and strongpoints with limited artillery support, paying a terrible price for each position taken. Now, for the first time, German soldiers were witnessing the complete destruction of positions they had considered invulnerable. The psychological impact was immense. If concrete bunkers could not protect them, what could? If American artillery could reach out more than 12 miles to destroy any target with precision, where could they be safe? The reports from Aachen suggest entire companies abandoning positions rather than face another bombardment. Patterson continued, "We may be seeing the beginning of a general collapse in German defensive confidence." Bradley smiled grimly around his pipe stem. This was exactly the kind of advantage American industry was supposed to provide. Weapons so superior that they not only won battles but broke the enemy's will to continue fighting. The 240mm howitzer was proving to be more than just another artillery piece. It was becoming a strategic weapon that could accelerate the end of the war itself. November 8, 1944. The ancient fortress city of Metz, France. For 17 centuries, the city had stood as a bastion of military engineering, its walls and fortifications refined by countless generations of warriors and architects. The great military engineer Vauban had strengthened its defenses in the 17th century, creating what many considered the strongest fortress complex in Western Europe. Sergeant First Class John Arthaud positioned his 240mm howitzer on the heights overlooking the Moselle River, studying the massive stone fortifications through his field glasses. Fort Driant, Fort de Cueilleux, and a dozen smaller strongpoints bristled with concrete bunkers and artillery positions. German defenders had been improving these positions for 4 years, adding steel-reinforced concrete to Vauban's original stone walls. Range to primary target, 18 to 500 yards, called forward observer Captain Robert Sterling from his advanced position. Wind negligible, atmospheric conditions excellent for long-range fire. Arthaud's crew had become experts in the devastating routine of heavy bombardment. Private First Class Mike O'Connor and Tony Kowalski moved with practiced efficiency, loading the 360-pound high-explosive shell and ramming it home. The powder charges followed in careful sequence, each bag handled with the respect due to high explosives. Target, Fort Driant, main bunker complex. Sterling's voice crackled through the radio. Fire for effect. The gun fired with its characteristic earth-shaking roar. 24 seconds later, Arthaud watched through his field glasses as medieval stone and modern concrete erupted skyward in a column of dust and debris. The shell had struck the main entrance to the fort, collapsing passages that had been carved from solid rock centuries earlier. Target hit, Sterling reported. Estimate heavy damage to bunker complex. Request repeat. For the next 6 hours, American 240mm batteries methodically demolished fortifications that had been considered impregnable for centuries. Shell after shell crashed into stone walls that had resisted siege guns, cannons, and conventional artillery for 400 years. Each impact created damage that would have taken months to repair, assuming repair was even possible. Captain Heinrich Zimmermann, commanding the German garrison at Fort Driant, crouched in a stone corridor as another American shell detonated overhead. Chunks of masonry crashed down around him, filling the air with choking dust. The electric lighting had failed after the third direct hit. Emergency lanterns cast dancing shadows on walls that had begun to crack ominously. Herr Hauptmann, called Unteroffizier Karl Becker, the north bunker has collapsed completely. 17 men trapped inside. Zimmermann had commanded this position for 2 years, confident that its combination of natural rock and reinforced concrete made it virtually indestructible. French engineers had spent centuries perfecting these defenses. German military engineers had added modern improvements. Together, they had created what should have been an impregnable position. The American artillery was proving all their calculations wrong. "Sir, we're receiving reports from Fort de Couleur," Becker continued, his voice tight with strain. "Direct hits on their main bunker complex. They're requesting permission to evacuate to secondary positions." Through a crack in the stone wall, Zimmerman could see American infantry advancing across ground that should have been swept by defensive fire from intact gun positions. But his gun positions were no longer intact. The unknown American weapons were systematically destroying every defensive point that had made Metz a fortress. "How many shells have they fired?" Zimmerman asked. Becker consulted his notebook with shaking hands. "More than 200 heavy rounds since this morning, sir. We estimate at least 6 different battery positions. 200 shells. In previous battles, German positions had withstood thousands of rounds of conventional artillery with minimal damage. Now, 200 rounds from American heavy guns had reduced centuries of fortification to rubble. Another shell impacted directly above their position. The stone ceiling groaned ominously, and a new crack appeared in the wall beside them. Water began dripping from somewhere overhead. The impact had probably ruptured the main cistern that supplied the fort's water system. "Becker, prepare the men for withdrawal to the river positions," Zimmerman ordered. "We cannot hold this position against weapons we cannot counter." It was the first time in his career that Zimmerman had ordered abandonment of a prepared fortress, but staying in Fort Bryant under continued bombardment by American 240mm guns was not military necessity. It was suicide. 4,000 miles away, at the Watervliet Arsenal in New York, the weapons destroying Metz's ancient fortifications were being manufactured with the relentless efficiency of American wartime production. Master machinist Robert Sullivan worked his 3rd consecutive double shift, guiding cutting tools through another massive gun barrel. The demand for 240mm Howitzers had exceeded all projections, requiring round-the-clock production to meet military requirements. "Sullivan, how many barrels have we completed this month?" asked Shift Supervisor Thomas Bradley, checking production figures against his ever-growing quota sheets. 47 barrels completed and shipped," Sullivan replied, not pausing in his work. "Another 23 in various stages of completion. We're running about 10% ahead of schedule." Around them, the arsenal hummed with unprecedented activity. Every machine tool was in constant operation. Workers moved with practiced efficiency between boring machines, lathes, and finishing stations. The sound was constant: cutting tools, cooling systems, overhead cranes moving finished barrels toward the shipping docks. Bradley studied the production statistics with satisfaction. In November 1944, American industry was producing more heavy artillery in 1 month than Germany could manufacture in 6 months. The difference was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. American metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and quality control had advanced far beyond anything available to the enemy. "You know what I heard from the shipping office?" Bradley said, leaning closer to Sullivan's machine. "We're now producing more artillery steel in 1 week than the entire German war industry produced in 1943. Sullivan nodded, concentrating on maintaining the precise tolerances required for each gun barrel. He had seen the classified production reports comparing American and German manufacturing capacity. The numbers were staggering. American steel mills were producing more high-grade artillery steel in a single day than German factories could manage in a month. The industrial advantage was so overwhelming that it seemed almost unfair. Across the factory floor, another completed barrel was being lifted by overhead cranes toward the proof testing facility. Each gun would be fired dozens of times with maximum charges before being approved for shipment overseas. Quality control was absolute. No weapon left Watervliet unless it exceeded the specifications required to penetrate any known German fortification. "That barrel you're finishing," Bradley continued, "it'll be firing on German positions within 6 weeks, probably at some fortress the Germans think is impregnable." Sullivan smiled grimly and continued his precision work. Every cut of his machine, every careful measurement, every hour of labor was contributing directly to American victory. The Germans had built their defensive strategy around fortifications designed to resist known weapons. They had no defense against the industrial capacity of a free nation at full wartime production. Meanwhile, at a bombed-out factory in Essen, Germany, forced laborers struggled to maintain production under impossible conditions. The Krupp Armament Works, once the pride of German heavy industry, had been reduced to a collection of damaged buildings and salvaged machinery by months of Allied bombing. Heinrich Müller, a French prisoner of war assigned to artillery production, worked beside furnaces that operated only intermittently due to power shortages. The contrast with American production was absolute. Where American factories hummed with modern machinery and abundant materials, German factories limped along with patched equipment and substitute materials. "Müller, how many gun barrels this week?" asked Obermeister Weber, the German production supervisor, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man fighting impossible quotas with inadequate resources. 7 barrels started, sir. Only 3 completed to specifications. We lack proper steel for the others. Weber marked his production sheet with obvious frustration. German artillery production had fallen by more than half since 1942, while American production had increased exponentially. The material advantage was becoming insurmountable. Through the factory's broken windows, Müller could see the ruins of buildings destroyed in the latest Allied air raid. Machine tools lay twisted and unusable. Skilled German workers had been drafted into combat units, replaced by forced laborers who lacked the expertise to maintain quality production. The steel shortage was becoming critical. Germany's iron ore supplies had been disrupted by Allied advances. Coal production was declining due to bombing of transportation networks. Even when raw materials were available, power shortages limited production to a few hours each day. "Weber," Müller said quietly, "the Americans are outproducing us 50-1, perhaps 100-1. How can we continue?" Weber had no answer. The numbers were undeniable. American industrial reports captured through intelligence sources revealed production figures that seemed impossible. Single American factories were producing more artillery in 1 month than the entire German war industry could manage in 6 months. Back at Metz, the systematic destruction of 17th century fortifications continued around the clock. American artillery crews had established a routine of methodical bombardment that left no stone unturned. Fort after fort fell to concentrated fire from weapons that had never existed when Vauban designed his defensive masterpieces. By November 15th, more than 25,000 240mm shells had been fired at the Metz fortress complex. Ancient walls that had resisted siege guns, Napoleon's artillery, and 4 years of German improvements lay in ruins. American infantry advanced through breaches that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The psychological effect on German defenders extended far beyond Metz itself. Word of the fortress city's fall spread rapidly through Wehrmacht units across Western Europe. If Metz could not hold against American firepower, what position could? If 17 centuries of military engineering could be demolished in a week, what defense was possible? German soldiers began abandoning positions at the first sound of American heavy artillery, unwilling to face weapons against which they had no protection. The defensive doctrine that had served the Wehrmacht for 3 years was collapsing under the weight of American industrial supremacy. December 15, 1944. Washington, D.C., the War Department's Statistical Analysis Division occupied an entire floor of the massive Pentagon building, its offices filled with clerks, calculators, and filing cabinets containing the detailed records of American industrial production. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison reviewed monthly artillery production reports that documented the overwhelming superiority of American manufacturing capacity. "Colonel, the November figures are extraordinary," reported Captain Sarah Mitchell, one of the few women officers assigned to statistical analysis. Artillery shell production exceeded 800,000 rounds in a single month. That's more than Germany produced in all of 1943. Harrison studied the columns of numbers that told the story of American victory through industrial dominance. Since January 1944, American factories had produced more than 12 million artillery shells of all calibers. German production for the same period totaled fewer than 2 million rounds, many of inferior quality due to material shortages. What about the 240mm specifically? Harrison asked. Mitchell consulted her detailed breakdowns. Over 37,000 rounds produced since deployment began. Average of 1,200 rounds per month, with production accelerating. Watervliet Arsenal is now operating at 150% of design capacity. The numbers were staggering, even to military professionals accustomed to large-scale operations. American industry was producing more heavy artillery ammunition in 1 week than German factories could manufacture in 3 months. The material advantage was so overwhelming that it bordered on the impossible. Harrison walked to the large wall map that tracked artillery deployments across Europe. Red pins marked positions where 240mm howitzers had been employed. Each pin represented devastation beyond anything the German army had previously experienced. Aachen, Metz, dozens of lesser fortifications, all reduced to rubble by weapons that existed only because American industry could produce them in quantity. Captain, prepare a summary report for General Marshall, Harrison directed. Include comparative production figures for the past 12 months. I want him to see exactly how completely we've outproduced the enemy. The report would make sobering reading for anyone who understood its implications. In 1944, American steel production exceeded German production by a factor of 5 to 1. American machine tool production was 8 times greater than German capacity. Most critically, American artillery production was running at more than 10 times German rates, with quality control that German industry could no longer match. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Sergeant First Class John Arthod sat in the recreation tent, writing a letter to his wife Martha back in Ohio. Around him, other members of the 697th Field Artillery Battalion cleaned equipment and prepared for what everyone hoped would be their final deployment of the war. The 240mm howitzers had proven so effective that German resistance was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. Dear Martha, Arthod wrote carefully, we're heading back to Europe next month, but the word is that things are going much better than expected. The big guns we've been using have knocked down every wall the Germans built. Some of the boys think the war might be over by summer. Arthod paused, considering how much he could safely write about their operations. Military censorship prohibited detailed descriptions of weapons and tactics, but he could convey the general sense of overwhelming American superiority. The Germans built these huge concrete forts, thinking they were safe behind thick walls. But our artillery can knock down anything they build. Yesterday we got word that another fortress city surrendered without a fight, rather than face bombardment. The enemy just doesn't have an answer for American firepower. Private First Class Mike O'Connor looked up from his own letter writing. Sergeant, do you really think it'll be over by summer? O'Connor, I've seen what these guns can do to the strongest positions the Germans have. If they can't hold behind concrete walls, they can't hold anywhere. American industry has given us weapons they simply cannot match. Around the tent, other crew members nodded agreement. They had witnessed the devastating effect of American 240mm artillery on targets that had been considered impregnable. Every fortification, every bunker, every defensive position felt a concentrated fire from weapons that German engineers had never imagined possible. The psychological effect was perhaps even more important than the physical destruction. German soldiers were abandoning positions rather than face American heavy artillery. The defensive confidence that had sustained Wehrmacht morale for 3 years was crumbling under the impact of weapons that made any fixed position untenable. In Aachen, Germany, Anna Müller emerged from her shelter into a city transformed beyond recognition. 80% of the buildings lay in ruins, their walls shattered by artillery fire of unprecedented intensity. American engineers had already begun restoring water and electrical service, working with efficient competence that contrasted sharply with the destruction around them. Captain William Peterson, commanding a company of Army engineers, supervised the installation of temporary water pipes along what had once been the city's main commercial street. His men worked with practiced efficiency, drilling through rubble and connecting systems that would restore basic services to the surviving civilian population. "Ma'am, you'll have running water by tomorrow morning," Peterson told Anna through a German interpreter. "We're also working on electrical power for essential services." Anna nodded gratefully, still struggling to comprehend the transformation that had overtaken her city. The American soldiers were nothing like the occupying forces she had expected. They worked to restore rather than exploit, to rebuild rather than destroy beyond necessity. Her son Heinrich played among the rubble with other children, their resilience providing hope for the future. The boy had adapted quickly to the American presence, learning English words from soldiers who shared chocolate and chewing gum with obvious good humor. "Heinrich, stay close," Anna called. "Don't interfere with the soldiers' work," but the American engineers seemed to enjoy the children's presence. Several had families of their own back home and welcomed the opportunity to interact with youngsters who reminded them why they were fighting. The contrast with German propaganda descriptions of American forces could not have been more complete. Anna watched American trucks arrive with supplies for civilian relief, food, medical equipment, construction materials. The abundance was overwhelming after years of wartime shortages. These soldiers represented a nation whose industrial capacity seemed unlimited, whose resources appeared inexhaustible. Through the interpreter, Captain Peterson explained that American policy emphasized rapid restoration of civilian services in liberated areas. Military government teams would establish schools, hospitals, and administrative services as quickly as practical. The goal was to demonstrate that American occupation meant reconstruction, not continued destruction. "Tell her," Peterson said to the interpreter, "that we're here to help rebuild, not to punish civilians for their government's actions." At the Watervliet Arsenal, the final 240mm Howitzer barrel of 1944 was being completed with ceremonial attention to detail. Master machinist Robert Sullivan guided his cutting tools through the last pass, achieving tolerances that exceeded original specifications. Around him, workers gathered to watch the completion of a weapon system that had become symbolic of American industrial supremacy. "That's barrel number 847 for the year," announced Shift Supervisor Thomas Bradley. "More heavy artillery than any nation has ever produced in a single year." Sullivan stepped back from his machine, wiping his hands on a cloth as he studied the gleaming steel barrel. 32 feet of precision-bored steel, capable of firing 360-pound shells more than 13 miles with accuracy that German gunners could not match. The barrel represented thousands of hours of skilled labor, tons of the highest quality steel, and manufacturing precision that few nations could achieve even in peacetime. "Bradley, what happens to these guns after the war?" Sullivan asked. "Some will be kept in reserve, but most will probably be scrapped or mothballed." "Nuclear weapons are making big guns like this obsolete," Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. The 240mm Howitzer had been the largest mobile artillery piece in American service, but atomic weapons would soon make conventional artillery seem almost quaint. Still, for the crucial months of 1944 and 1945, these guns had provided American forces with overwhelming firepower advantages that hastened the end of the war. Workers began signing their names on the completed barrel, a tradition that connected them personally to the weapon they had created. Each signature represented pride in craftsmanship, satisfaction in contributing to American victory, and confidence that their work had shortened the war and saved American lives. The barrel would be shipped to Europe within 2 weeks, fired in combat within a month, and probably retired from service within 5 years. But its brief career would demonstrate conclusively that American industrial democracy could produce weapons of such superiority that totalitarian opponents had no effective response. As 1944 ended, the 240mm Howitzer stood as a symbol of American victory through industrial supremacy. German fortifications, built over centuries and strengthened with the best engineering available, had proven helpless against weapons that existed only because American factories could produce them in quantity and quality beyond enemy comprehension. The lesson was clear. In modern warfare, Industrial capacity determined battlefield success more completely than martial tradition, defensive engineering, or even tactical skill. American democracy, freed to produce at full capacity, had created weapons that made enemy defensive strategies obsolete and hastened the end of history's most destructive war. If you enjoyed the story at hand, pick this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.